talk about education, so and I'm going to make reference to the fact that in our school systems, we do not take advantage of or teach the richness that is available to us in our own and other traditions. So I think I'll just start by reading a very, very short passage from a Confucian scripture called the Doctrine of the Mean, which is about education. It's very simple, very true, and beautiful. The Doctrine of the Mean begins like this: what heaven, or nature with a capital N, imparts to man is called nature, or human nature. I think the word imparts is called command. What heaven commands is called your nature. Cultivating, to follow our nature, is called Tao, or the way. Cultivating the way is called education. End of formula. What heaven commands is called nature. To follow our nature is called the way, or Tao. Cultivating the Tao is called education. So why can't we cultivate the Tao in our schools? Why can't we develop ourselves in the school? Does the church own your soul? If it did, the separation of church and state would be an absolute doctrine that would mean you couldn't bring it up in school at all. But in fact, the church doesn't own your soul. And it's not something that's fundamentally religious, not in the sense of pulpit Christianity anyway. So why can't we cultivate our soul in schools? Cultivate persons, the interior reality. First you have to cultivate an interior reality, and then you have to bring it to life. So that's just one of the many, 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 many riches that our children, we will never hear about in school, unless we happen by accident to bump into one of those teachers who's an exception to the rule and is also enough of a warrior to set himself or herself against the system. Not something that's very common. So, I call this Following Your Dream in the American Education. And it'll take us maybe an hour, and I'm just going to read it, though I'll stop and extrapolate if the Spirit moves me. Or if you're not following or have a question, just let me know. Okay. This topic has been on my mind for many years. Its title first came to me a few years ago when I saw the advertisement on the cover of a class schedule of a California college where I taught for many years. The cover that semester read, quote, "Grossmont College, where dreams are," end quote. And on the second page it said, quote unquote, "Follow your dreams." The small print below that stated, "Come to Grossmont College and you won't have to look far to see dreams being realized. Aspiring artists filling canvases with color. Pre-med students learning the basics of biology. Budding journalists pounding away at their typewriters and at their dreams. You see, Grossmont College is a place where people come to seek out their true potential. Whatever your motivation, we're here to help you every step of the way." End quote. That's quite a bit. Nice place to go to school. And so that you won't dismiss this as an ancient story or as a strange anomaly, I will point out that just the other day I read on the marquee of a local junior high school just over here, in big letters, "Don't forget the dream." There wasn't anything else there but that. Don't forget the dream. So presumably they're doing some dreamy stuff over there. Though I doubt it. Now, all of this sounds very nice. However, when I opened that catalog, I found that there were no classes either on dreams or on how to follow them. This struck me and continues to strike me as a singular omission. What about you? Even my freshman students, in those days, when I asked them what this is an example of, were usually able to answer without too much deliberation that it looks like just another piece of Madison Avenue prevarication, a lie. This omission, of course, brings into question the sincerity and purpose of educational institutions. Should education be involved in the questionable business of advertising and selling a so-called product, which benefits from and depends for success upon the gullibility of the public and in the process further enslaves those who we ought to liberate? Let me repeat that. Should education be involved in the questionable business of advertising and selling a so-called product, which benefits from and depends upon, for success, the gullibility of the public, and in the process further enslaves those who we ought to liberate? In fact, ought we to be in the busyness of selling anything at all? I, for one, am a teacher, not a salesman, and resent being placed in the impossible position of trying to teach people who are told that it is entirely within the nature of things for them to expect me to pander to their every wish. That is to say, their untutored motivations, their untutored desire. And if I do make a so-called pitch, as it were, in the classroom, it will be in the form of a warning concerning the dangers involved in being uncritically related to the reduction of education to the motives and concerns of the marketplace. Now, it is a fundamental rule of the marketplace that the desire life of the consumer rules very nearly absolutely. The customer is always right, we say. Yet it nevertheless remains the case that an educator, notice I use the singular, standing at a decent remove from that marketplace, might still inform the student's desire life with ends that are worth seeking. That is to say, with real ideals. This, after all, is the central function of education. Let me repeat this. The central function of education is to inform the student's desire life with ends worth seeking. Now, notice I'm using the word inform there in the old sense, to form within, not to give information in the so-called information age, where we have access to Googles of information, and yet still aren't told the truth. I don't mean you can't find the truth on the internet. I mean it's pretty hard to find it within the system. Looked at in this way, both education and the marketplace could remain in their proper place and each function correctly. However, the language of the marketplace, which is currently affecting educational rhetoric, is a sign of the degree to which we have allowed businessmen and politicians to take over our campuses and redefine for us, both teacher and student, what we ought to be doing. Whereas education might inform and guide manufacture is the old-fashioned word, but today we would say the marketplace. It might guide manufacture. Today, the confused ends of the marketing machine have usurped the guiding role both of manufacture and of life. This happens because manufacture for use, which was the old school, has been confused with manufacture for profit. Properly understood, profit is a natural element in manufacture. The artist makes a profit so that he can go on practicing his art, but profit is not his end. A good example of this is ready to hand. The quote from the class schedule given above says, and I quote, "Whatever your motivation, we're here to help you every step of the way." This, unfortunately, is not mere rhetoric. It is for the most part an educational fact and indicates that not just the language, but also the ethics of the marketplace are taking over higher education. They're taking over lower education as well. Though I don't like the word, but elementary school, secondary. As we know, business people do not usually concern themselves with the motives behind their customers' commercial needs. Increasingly today, college, university, and primary and secondary administrators as well are preaching the same ethics. Their slogan is, give them what they want. Give them what they want. And in the process, the purpose of education is being rapidly inverted. The traditional curriculum concerned itself with the cultivation of the source of action, with the human soul. And when that tended to what was low and vulgar, educators and a considerable sum of inherited Western and Eastern culture were readily available to remind students that there is, after all, no profit, even if you gain the whole world at the expense of your soul. Despite the obvious negligence and failure of educators in the past, I mean by this that we know that educators have failed in the past as well. They were disciplinarians, they were concerned about control more than about transference of light. We went through all of that, people in my generation did, and I'm sure the generation before that. But nevertheless, they were closer to the inherited traditions than we are today. So despite the failures of educators in the past, the stated end of the traditional curriculum then was a hale and whole individual. Individual meaning undivided person, not divided person. Incidentally, the word sincerity means one. So the sincere person is the person that's doing one thing. Not two, not five, not 10, not with 1,000 friends. One thing. The word sincere is the same root as the word same or sink. It means one. A single act of attention, my teacher used to say. So a hale and whole individual. Again, the educator who wanted really to teach had behind him the whole force of an ancient and well-articulated statement of the purpose of education and the purpose of human life. In today's political environment, however, this project has become almost totally unintelligible, and instead of cultivating the individual soul, education follows the money and serves those who control it. Likewise, instead of guiding and changing the herdish motives of an untutored public, educators follow and serve them. I mean, everything is upside down. And since this has been going on for a long time now, all too often the motives of this untutored public are in fact mirrored by those who ought to lift them up. I mean, by teachers themselves. I mean, if I'm talking to an educator who does not understand what I'm talking about and can't even get a sense of it, things have gone very, very far. The thing has been lost. Why? Because it's been going on for a long time. Do you see what I mean? Okay. By now, almost every educator in the country is the product of the same system they so thoughtlessly perpetuate. Notice, I'm not saying here that there are no exceptional teachers. I hope myself that I am one. I'm making generalities about the many. Heraclitus said the many are bad and the few are good. It's true also in the profession of the doctor. It's true everywhere. How could it not be? What did you tell me the other day? The cabinet makers refinish by spraying water on the wood. It exposes the grain. It's a cheap way to do the job. Those are the many, not the few. I didn't know that. I'm plug that stuff right into lectures, you know. So thank you. Thank you for that. All right. So, the same system that they thoughtlessly perpetuate. This is a cultural disaster that is already upon us. For educators, the bottom line has become, as one district level administrator put it to me, survival. I understood this to be an educational variation of better read than dead. I hope I'm making myself clear here. You know this expression, better read than dead? Convert to communism rather than go to prison. Not to fight for principle, but preserve yourself. Better read than dead. So, teachers are looking out for themselves. Survival. You gotta eat, one fellow told me. You gotta eat. This fellow, I talked to him, he had come to look at an apartment that we rent. And he told me he was a teacher. I said, oh, really? Where do you teach? And I drew the fellow out. He didn't know who I was, you know, so he was quite open. It wasn't fair, but I had fun with it. And he said, I said, oh, you must, you know, it's a war out there. You must be awful. He said, oh my God, I could tell you stories. It's so terrible. And I said, well, what's going on? He said, well, you know what the problem is? And I said, no, what? He said, it's lazy students. And I said, well, I can well believe that is the case. I was fairly lazy myself when I was a student. And I said, but, you know, when the students are lazy, they come to school, they're not prepared, they do poorly on the test, you just, you know, fail them. He said, oh, no, there's another problem. I said, oh, it's a little more complex than you initially suggested. He said, well, yes. And I said, well, what is it? He said, well, the administrators, you know, they're watching over you, and if you fail more than 10%, it's your fault. I said, oh, so you're saying in addition to there being lazy students, the administrators don't support the teachers? He said, that's right. And I said, of course, then we probably have some lazy parents in there as well. He said, well, that's right too. And I said, well, it's, you know, it's then a little more complex than you initially told me. He said, well, yes. And I said, but, I said, in the last analysis, if the student comes in and fails the class, you know, you have to fail them. He said, no. And I said, what do you mean, no? He said, you've got to eat. By which he meant that if he bucked the system, he would be fired. Follow? So I looked at him and I said, well, so what you're telling me then is that if the student fails and you're willing to give the student a passing grade when they don't deserve it, teachers really can't stand on the high ground that they claim they're standing on. He looked at me and he blinked, and he did a military about face, and he walked directly away down the sidewalk. Never saw the apartment. He walked away at top speed. No goodbye. No fare thee well. He just turned away and walked away at top speed. He wasn't about to be challenged. He wasn't about to face the truth of his own ethical situation. He certainly wasn't a warrior. That's what I mean by this. Better read than dead. You gotta eat. However,
you don't have to pay him royalties for the storage either.
I don't. Well, I'm glad to hear that because I don't have any money to pay him with. You don't make much money relating these stories, by the way. However,
You made less when you didn't get a chance to show him the apartment. You might have told him after you got his money.
well, you know, that is absolutely right. So that, you know, a critical, smart business person would wait, you know, get the money across the counter, and then let the guy have it. Don't take a check, get cash. But philosophers are notoriously bad about taking care of themselves like this. After all, sometimes it's more fun to have these little conversations than it is to be financially solvent. However, while administrators might disagree with me in private, they will not disagree with me publicly that higher education without ideals is a contradiction. Why? Because they are not above using the language of those ideals in the interest of motivating, that is to say, manipulating public behavior. Therefore, they are not above using the rhetoric of higher education, while at the same time redefining and reducing the same in the direction of lower and remedial levels. They are not above using the language of dreams to catch and retain potential students in an institution which, as it turns out, offer nothing higher than the egocentricity of the profit motive and the vulgar dream of getting more than your neighbor. This brings us back to the subject at hand, education and the dream. What is a dream? A dream, as every child knows, is meant to be followed. Remember the dream, the Marquis said. We all know this because we were at one time children, whether we remember it or not. We also know that to not follow one's dream is to betray it, which is the same, of course, as betraying one's self. Self with a capital C. This does not mean that the self, capital Sigma, is something that we already have in hand, but may decide at some point to give up, to don't. That's ridiculous. That's not it at all. That's a presumption. Rather, the self is that to which the authentic dream leads. To dream, then, is to dream of the self. Thus, education, ideally understood, is the means by which the dream is found, propitiated, and hopefully realized. All of that is necessary. It's a process. Lao Tzu says, great powers come late.
Can I interrupt? Just because you said at any time to say something.
Sure.
Grossmont, is that community college in San Diego?
Yeah, it's also my alma mater. I was a student there for a couple of years before I went to university.
I was enrolled in there, I never went, but I enrolled in the airline stewardess school when I was like 18 at that
Oh,
college.
they had that. I didn't know that.
They did. And I'm thinking that at that age and without any expertise or education or anything young, most children don't know what they want to be when they grow up. And when the school is talking about dreams, maybe they're talking about, we have a smorgasbord of different opportunities for you to, try to become, whether you want to be a teacher, or airline stewardess, or whatever. We'll help you support in that process while you're dreaming. I'm just wondering if that's what they intended when they put all that wording in.
First of all, it was a sales job. Secondly, the idea that the student already knows is, of course, a fallacy. Third, school ought to be about helping them to find, which is not by just throwing a bunch of alternatives out there which the students are not prepared to decide between. You have to teach the affections, the desire life of the person to choose that which is true, good, and beautiful, and move away from that which is false and ugly. In other words, as C.S. Lewis taught, you cultivate the affections. Then the student freely chooses for himself or herself, because they have become cultivated choosers. They can't do that if they're not brought into connection with ideals, with what is true, what is good, what is beautiful, into familiarity with that. But they're not. Counselors tell students who's hiring. It's about money. You know, it changes from decade to decade, you know, it's IBM one decade, and computer programming the next, and aerospace before that, and what will it be next? We don't know.
I see your drift on that, and I follow that, because I know when I went back to college, after many, many years of successful medical clinic and that kind of thing,
Yes.
I went back to follow my calling, and I gave up all my income, et cetera, to do all that. So I didn't go back to
Foolish philosopher.
I know.
Okay,
So I didn't
all right.
go back to make money. And I thought it was very interesting when I was in college because they were thinking, yeah, the mindset that we're going to school so we can get a good paying job. And I'm thinking, well, that's not why I'm here. So
Well,
it was kind of, that was the mindset.
that is right, and that is what, the people will go along with what's provided for them. If they never hear about another alternative, they still might not go along with it, but for them not to hear about it is criminal.
Well, of course, though, they do want them to pay back their school loans. Not everybody can do what I've done.
Let me tell you a story. At the university, which is also my alma mater and where I taught for many years, I used to go for, you know, coffee or whatever to one of the cafeterias, whichever one it was, and that's where I almost always went. And I would occasionally sit with a student, or a student would sit down next to me, and we'd fall into a conversation. And I would always ask them, you know, what are you studying? You know, what is your major? And they would always tell me, you know, it was business or something like that. And so I would always ask them the same question. I'll dutifully do my Socratic thing, and I would say, well, what do you love? And to a person, every one of them, every time, told me something other than what they were doing. Every one. And so I said, listen, let me ask you a question. You know, when you go home tonight and you open your refrigerator, no, and first I would ask them, I said, well, why are you studying something that you don't love? And the answer was always the same. You gotta eat. So we're back to filling the belly. And so then I would say to them, look, when you get home this evening and you open the refrigerator, is there food in there? And the students, you know, would look at me and say, well, yes. And I said, so why would you spend an extra 2 or 3 years or 4 studying something you don't love in order to get something you already have? And they, I think all of them, to a person, said in response to that something very similar, something like this: I want more. I said, well, if that's what it is, then we know where you're coming from. Not even, you know, they were just vulgar people, and that's what they had become, and they were going to stand there. I want more. More for me. Hog in trough. Socrates used to say, you know, it's a question of whether you live to eat or eat to live. For Socrates, you were eating to live, not living to eat, to consume more.
I think the challenge we have is that all these wonderful things I started hearing when I was in college, they don't tell you that when you're little, ground up, and that's when they need to start. You know, follow you can be anything you want to be, but we're not taught that. We're taught something different, and that's not the real world out there. You can't do it that way. You'll get hurt. I mean, I heard that when I was little. No, I'm going to do what I think is the right thing to do, no matter what. You know, but that's not what we were
Well, the
taught.
children are not prepared to set themselves against that. By nature.
You're a product of your environment.
Yes.
That's basically what it is.
If you don't have the inner strength to do it, and most children don't, you know, you're in trouble. I wasted my entire youth on television. Not because I wanted to watch television, because I wasn't strong enough without some help to stay away from the thing that was droning in the next room.
It's worse today.
Oh, it's a lot worse today. So there's a lot of things they don't tell us, and if you heard things that were higher than that when you went back to school, then you were lucky. Some people don't hear any of that.
Well, what I saw in school was that we were, you know, they teach you how to, that's when you start learning how to think.
Well, if you do, you're lucky,
but
because
they-
you won't get every philosophy class.
Okay.
Take my word for it, that's where I taught.
Well, I was just using that as an example, but, you know, it's been years since I was in college too, but to me, it was like, wow, this is kind of neat that you now have this opportunity. They still tell you a lot of time what to think, but, or where, you know, maybe where you should go, kind of, but it still opened our mind to something that we never got in high school. And in high school is when we should have been getting it, we should have gotten it earlier than that.
Earlier in high school,
Cultivating-
sure.
Well, from grade school up, I think,
Yes.
absolutely.
It starts in the home.
Yeah,
Well-
absolutely, that's the problem.
But if it's not in the home, the teacher has the responsibility to introduce the child to another set of ideas. If they don't, then their behavior is, in my view, criminal. Okay. Education then ought to be a practical working out of that principle, seek and ye shall find. It follows from this that true educators must therefore be followers of their own dreams. For it is the primary business of the educator to have first-hand knowledge of the dream of authentic human existence, and how to follow that dream. Thus, educators ought to be men and women who have faith in human nature's highest possibility, and the dreams that seek it. And the dream, as I hope to make clear, is not something that can be prescribed by the community or anything external to the individual student. And it is certainly not the same as the ego's misguided concern for its own private interests, whether those be exalted so-called professional interests or the various faces of the various faces of the voter reduction of life to the false promises of the marketplace. These are really very simple observations, and I'm afraid that no one who refuses to concede this is in a position even to become educated, much less to become an educator. As for those who
Please
are...
repeat.
Yes. No one who refuses to concede this point is in a position to become educated, even to become educated, much less to become an educator. You have to start as an empty cup. The full cup cannot take on more. Modesty is fundamental as tranquility. As for those who are undecided concerning this, if there be such, they must choose to remain open, the empty cup, to the possibility of a genuinely efficacious dream, a dream of power. This, however, is not a choice between apples and oranges. This is a radical either-or. It involves a decision, and indeed a decision that, humanly speaking, cannot be avoided. In other words, to have decided that dreaming is nonsense, or to choose not to remain open to its potential significance and value, is to already have decided, and that is that. The result of such a posture is that any higher grasp of what it means to be a human being is denied to the one holding that position. Again, the full cup. And since it is really quite impossible to live without a dream, as both Dostoevsky and his Grand Inquisitor well knew, one is left, therefore, with dreams of a lower quality, disguised, of course, as something higher. This brings us to the distinction between those qualities. When I was a student at the community college, I was introduced to these ideas the way you were when you went back to school. I was a little older than the other students, and the teachers were on fire. They were excited about what they were doing. They introduced me to ideas and literatures that I'm still enjoying and learning from now. Years later, when I was one of their colleagues and I challenged them on some of their behavior, they turned on me with a hatred and a spite that was almost unbelievable. They wanted to assassinate me, and they tried. Fortunately, I'd read enough of the books that they had themselves given me that I had enough funded power that I just stopped them. It wasn't pleasant, but I just stopped them. So, dreams of a lower quality, disguised, of course, as something higher. This brings us to the distinction between those qualities. There are basically three distinct qualities of dreaming, at least that I'm going to talk about this evening. And we'll put them into some little convenient mental categories. Tentatively, I will call the first the American dream, the second the dream of the exalted ego, and the third destiny, or the dream of the self, capital sigma. Only the third type of dream is genuine. It is not, however, something one knows. Rather, it is what one seeks out of a conscious relationship to one's longing for something that is unknown, and one's dissatisfaction with what generally stands in for knowledge. One can't be satisfied with what the world offers you and be a follower of the way. It's just impossible. It's mutually exclusive. If you take in that colored pill, you're finished.
Repeat, one cannot be satisfied with what the world.
One can't be satisfied with what the world offers you and be a person who's on the way. If you're satisfied with that, you've taken the wrong pill. The way, in all traditions, in all cultures, is the negative way. Neti, neti, not this, not that. It's the Socratic dialectic. Something is offered, you push it aside. Something is offered, you push it aside. You keep on saying no, as Lao Tzu says, until you reach the state of non-ado. Something else opens up.
I simply just put that one cannot be satisfied with the material world that they're offering you. Isn't that really what you're saying?
Well, it is a material vision, and we have to get some distance on that. But we are given lots that is just false. So Nisargadatta Maharaj says again and again and again, he says, it is not necessary that you understand. We're talking about this knowing or not knowing. He said, it is not enough, it is not necessary for you to understand. It is only necessary that you do not misunderstand. Someone presents you a snake and you say, oh, a nice rope, and you're finished. Someone offers you a nice rope, which you need, and you say, snake, you're finished. It is only enough that you do not misunderstand. And you cut away from what is false. That is the way. It's the same in all cultures. Neti, neti, not this, not that. Krishnamurti says about this, he says, when you see something that is false, he says, don't touch it. Don't touch it.
Authorji says if you touch it, it will bite you.
Sure, sure. And it won't let go either. You will have to struggle and struggle to be free of it. You have to shake that snake off. And most people won't do it. They'll be tired. Perseverance, too, is fundamental.
Bhagavad Haridas has a list of ways that God shines through you, and one of them is contentment in all conditions. And so there's a little, like I'm working on integrating that, this dissatisfaction with this contentment in all conditions.
There's no reason to be confused or have difficulty with that. When you talk about those things that are fundamental, the Buddha's condition is tranquility. And the traditions all say that that is fundamental. Jesus will tell you that the unity is fundamental. But that's the Buddha's condition over here. If you're not there, and if you're not there, you probably know you're not there, then let it go. It's not your business what the Buddha has attained. Your business is in the mirror every morning when you get up. Let that go. That's God's time. That's the clocks that have different faces in fairy. It's not this. This is the mirror. It's right here every day. You don't have to go beyond it. There's no reason for any confusion. But you hear people all the time who are talking about this stuff and confusing themselves. Sure, that is the ideal. The Buddha arrived at an awakening and he was in perfect bliss, or so the traditions say. Fine. What's that got to do with me? I look in the mirror and I'm not tranquil. I'm worried or I'm afraid or whatever. That is my way. Looking at myself. Of course I have the model of the Buddha. Good, keep it, but don't get confused about it. The way is the negative way. Neti.
I got it. I got it, yeah, because to not be satisfied with the falseness, to be satisfied with falseness will never give you true tranquility.
That's right.
That's right. So you're
Temporary,
not,
maybe.
Yeah, you're not satisfied with false tranquility, which is the way to get to the true tranquility, by cutting away neti. Yes, right.
And when we're worried about how we look,
Yes.
and we start making claims about ourselves. The people in the New Age community are doing this all the time. You know, I remember I went through this period when I spent 10 years in a cafe period, and I bumped into lots of these people, and it was quite a ride. And people used to say the same thing. They'd say, you know, I'm growing so much. Really, I'm growing so much. I mean, all of my boyfriends tell me the same. Bill and Bob and Jimmy, who comes to town on Wednesdays, they all tell me I'm doing just fine. I'm growing so much. And they start making claims about themselves. And immediately, they cut themselves off at the ankles. Because they want to be something so badly that they're not. Let it go. Be content to be the empty cup. It's such a burden that you can drop. You're not going to be utterly tranquil like the Buddha if you drop it, but you're going to be way better off. And you're going
You're
to
on the way.
You are for the moment.
Yes. And the
David,
moment is the only
For the
reality.
moment, right now, you are on the path. You're on that yellow brick road. The moment you see the Emerald City off in the distance, and you say, oh my God, surely the wizard is enthroned there. Let's cut across the poppy field. You're sunk. You leave the yellow brick road. Oh my God, there it is. You know, and that's the imaginary future. And that's the Wicked Witch of the West. She's the future, or our false relationship to her. Whenever they switch into the future tense in that movie, the witch shows up as a puff of sulfur and she's there. Future tense, look for her. Okay. So we're back to this knowing and unknown. Okay? So we're looking for something that is unknown and one's dissatisfaction with what generally stands in for knowing. One of my classmates told me once some fellow had come to her house to deliver something, and they got to talking about people that sell religion at the door. And he said, I don't know how to talk to them. He said, but when they come, and the fellow was uneducated and really inarticulate, he said, when they come, something in me just says, yuck, untrue. And she said, she had told him, she said, that is absolutely right. You just hold on to that intuition. It doesn't matter how articulate it is. You're right. It's false, and you should feel sick when you see it. And she sent him on his way. Yuck, untrue. Fine, you could see it. Cut away from it. Don't touch it. It'll bite you. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The place to begin is not with genuine dreams. We've already started this, thanks to David's interruption, rude interruption. The place to begin with is not genuine dreams, the Buddha's position. For today we know almost nothing of them, but with what stands in for them. In this way, we begin with what we do know, and are therefore on much safer ground. We know the false. Anything else, by the way, is just impatience, and not a virtue, but a vice. The first two dreams are surface dreams and belong to the outer world and therefore to the outer person. And although they seem on the surface quite normative, that is to say healthy, norm means health, they are neither normative nor healthy. They cannot be thought of as genuine.